Dayan Livnat's given a couple of shiurim to us in the past, and from July onwards, once we go into the new phase of the Chabura, Dayan Livnat is going to be a staple, whether he knows it or not. We need him, and we are very, very excited for future contributions of having someone teach us of his caliber. Dayan Livnat serves as a Dayan on the Sephardi Bet Din of London, a graduate of the Eretz Chemda Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies in Yerushalayim. Dayan Livnat teaches in a number of programs for training rabbis and Dayanim, including the Semicha and Dayanut programs run jointly by the Montefiore Endowment of London and Eretz Chemda. The Dayan is lecturer on Tanakh at the Jerusalem College, and he's previously served in an artillery unit in the IDF and is currently studying for a PhD in Jewish Studies at University College London. The Dayan is also going to be featured in an event that I wanted to make sure the Chabura members know about. I messaged it in the group, and I'll be messaging it again about the Conference of Dayanim that the Sephardi Bet Din are hosting on Sunday. All the information will be shared. Our Rosh Bet Midrash, Rabbi Dweck, will be attending as well, alongside other distinguished Hakhamim. Dayan Livnat, thank you so much for being here again. We're very looking forward to tonight's insightful shiur, and the stage is yours.
Okay, all right. So thank you, everyone. As you introduced, the learning is לרפואה שלמה של מרדכי בן סנובר בתוך שאר חולי ישראל.
And Dayan Livnat, if I could just say, if everyone could please mute. Sorry, if you want Dayan Livnat, you can make me host just so I can mute anyone who comes in who hasn't muted.
Okay, so here I'll make you co-host as well.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so tonight we're going to try and study a very, very difficult issue. The issue is going to be the status of halachot learned out from the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem, the 13 principles by which the Hakhamim derived halachot from analysis of the psukim of the Torah, the verses in the Torah. And this is one of these really, at least the opinion of the Rambam here seems to be very, very difficult to try to grasp. It's one of these issues that when you study, you're pretty sure that what everybody's written is wrong, but you don't have an answer yourself to what is correct. It's just that what everybody says seems to be contradicted one way or another. My Rebbe in Yeshiva, Rav Yonatan Rosin, he has said in the past that if you're really struggling with something, then the best way to try to get some understanding of it on it is to give a shiur on it. So that's a very high-risk strategy, but I don't recommend you run your stock portfolio that way. But if it works out at the end, then it can be very rewarding. So I hope that's what will happen tonight. Again, no guarantees, but we'll try. Okay, so what are we talking about? So basically, anybody who studied Gemara, Talmud, knows that a heavy proportion of the Talmud is dedicated to these kinds of discussions of what we call the Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. The Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem is essentially a certain type of techniques. There are some discussions exactly how many there are of them, and there are some arguments within Chazal themselves about some of them, how these techniques are going to be used. For those of us who say the korbanot in the morning, so we'll mention the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem, and basically a lot of the Talmud is speaking about that issue. In other words, this halakha, how it was according to even if there are disagreements, he learned it out from this pasuk because he derived it in this way. He learned it out from this pasuk, and a tremendous amount of the Talmud is dedicated just to these kinds of derivations from psukim of halachot. Now, the techniques are a bit surprising. If we look at them, we don't really understand how they work. It could be some sort of some of them are more logical to us. For example, a kal v'chomer. Kal v'chomer is a principle which is easier to understand because we say, if in a lighter case this is the principle, then all the more so it should be in a more severe situation. So that's something that we can understand. But some of the others have to do with there might be an extra word or seemingly an extra word. So from the fact that there's an extra word, we can sort of derive a whole halakha. So granted, there might be an extra word here, But how do you, from that, infer the entire halakha that you're trying to infer? Or you have gzera shava. If this word appears here and it appears there, then we can, let's say we have a certain halakha by one subject, and then the same word appears in another subject, so we can derive from one to the other. Or sometimes the Torah will say something of a general rule and then give examples. So then there's this idea of klal uprat, and there are all kinds of rules on how to do that. So do you go by the general rule? Do you go just by the specific examples? Some of them are easier for us to understand, some of them more difficult. But generally, sort of the approach that has been taken is that this was something that was done by Chazal in the past. And even though we study the Gemara and we try and understand what they were doing, even though it doesn't say anywhere that we're not allowed today to use Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem, doesn't say anywhere specifically that that you're not allowed to come along and do your own learning out of halachot from by these techniques of Torah Midreshet Behem. Nobody has done it really since the Talmud has ended. Nobody has attempted to do it since, because again, apparently we have, like, for example, by Gzera Shava, there's a limitation. Chazal say that's something you can't do unless you've received somehow by tradition from your rabbi, whatever that means. But there's no law that says you're not allowed to use Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem to derive halachot, but simply we don't do it because it seems to be that the understanding is that we don't really understand how Chazal did this, what they were doing. We don't, even though we try to sort of read about it, but we don't really fully grasp how this technique was used. And therefore we say that was something that was done in the past, and nobody has done it since. Now, I just want to make a qualification on that. Sometimes people think that we don't learn halachot from psukim anymore, that we only learn from Torah Sheba'al Peh. That, in my opinion, is not precise. We do find Rishonim that learn halachot directly from psukim. It's not very common, but there are examples for it. The Rambam does it several places in the Mishneh Torah, that he derives a certain halakha directly from a pasuk, from a verse, even though there's no source for it in Chazal. The Ramban, in his commentary ala Torah, also in a few places learns halachot directly from psukim. So it's not that the Torah shebichtav has been negated as a source for halakha. It still can be used, and it has been used. It's not very common because most of the 99.9% of the work has been done already by Chazal, but it is done by Rishonim occasionally. But they're not using Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. They're using just their interpretation of the psukim. So that's something that we're more confident about. But to go ahead and use the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem, that's something that's sort of, it might return in the future, but it's not done anymore. I'll mention there is a bit of a resurgence in the recent years of people who are trying to get more involved in how it's done, not to actually innovate halachot, but to try and understand. There's two groups at least that I'm aware of in Israel that have sort of formed together to try to engage more in the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. But as I said, it's not. I think it's good that they're doing it, and they've published some very interesting materials. But it's not a common feature anymore of our halachic process. So the question is how to understand what was going on with Chazal, with these Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. Were they actually innovating halachot, or were they merely finding sources for halachot that they already received by tradition through these techniques? That's one question. And the second question, or the big primary question, is how to understand these halachot which are derived by these techniques. Do they have the status of deoraita, because they are derived from psukim, so seemingly they should have the status of Torah law? Or perhaps, if they are done just by the Hakhamim, then maybe they should be relegated as halachot de Rabbana. Okay, so that's the question we're going to deal with. So I'm going to just mention very quickly two opinions, one of the Ralbag and the Ramban. Those are sort of the easy opinions to understand, and then we'll try to tackle the Rambam, who, as usual, causes us a lot of difficulty and aggravation in trying to understand what he's saying. Okay, so let's start with the Ralbag. The Ralbag is a very unique opinion. I don't think it's the prevalent opinion at all, but it's nice to keep that opinion in your mind. This is in the Ralbag. The Ralbag has a very, very long a commentary on the Torah. He also has on the Tanakh. So in his commentary on the Torah, he has an introduction where he sets out what his method of interpretation is going to be. And within that, he mentions the Yud Gimel Midot she'Torah nidreshet behen, and he says there as follows, because a lot of the commentary of the Ralbag on the halachic sections actually deals with halachot and how to derive them from the psukim. So he says, "V'hineh bebi'ur hamitzvot ve'ashorashim, asher mehem yitz'u kol dinehem asher yitba'aru bechokmot hatalmudiyot." Okay, in other words, when we explain the mitzvot and the roots from which all the halachot, all the laws came about, as explained in the Talmud, לא יהיה במנהגנו בכל המקומות לסמוך אותם השורשים, אלא מקומות אשר סמכו אותם חכמי התלמוד באחת מי"ג מידות לפי מנהגם. So he says, when I'll tell you the source of these halachot in the psukim, it's not going to be the source which the Talmud, the Chachmei Talmud that Chazal said is the source of the halachot, using the techniques of Yud Gimel Midot. In other words, it could be that you'll have the same halakha. The Ralbag is not going to argue on halakha with Chazal, but when he presents in his interpretation the source of the halakha, he's going to bring a different source than what the Gemara brought as a source based on the technique of Yud Gimel Midot. Why? So he says, וזה שהם סמכו אלו הדברים האמיתיים המקובלים להם במצוות התורה לפסוקים ההם, להיות כדמות רמז ואסמכתה לדברים ההם. לא שיהיה דעתם שיהיה מוצא אלו הדינים מאלו המקומות, כי כבר יוכל האדם להפך כל דיני התורה בכמו אלו ההיקשים, עד שאפשר בהם לטהר את השרץ כמו שזכרו זיכרונם לברכה. Okay, so he says, when Chazal were using these techniques of Yud Gimel Midot she'Torah nidreshet behem, they weren't innovating halachot based on these techniques. These were all halachot hamikubalim lehem, which they received by tradition, and they were using the Yud Gimel Midot, these 13 principles, just to find some sort of hint or some sort of slight basis to it in the psukim. Because if you were actually trying to create halachot based on these techniques, then there's no end to what you could do. You could turn over all the halachot of the Torah. You could even, he uses the expression of letaher et hasheretz, that you would have the ability to make something the sheretz, which we know is clearly tameh, it states it's in the psukim, to make it tahor. So therefore, it cannot be that they were actually deriving halachot based on these principles, because then you could basically do whatever you want, and anybody could make up any halachah that they want. Rather, they were just trying to find hints for the halachot that they received by traditions. Okay? אבל נסמוך אותם, but what we will do, נסמוך אותם על פשטי הפסוקים, אשר שאפשר שיצאו הדינים האלו מהם, כי בזה תתיישב הנפש יותר. He says, I'm going to provide other support for these halachot based on an interpretation of the pshat, the simple understanding of the text, again, from which it's possible also to derive these halachot, because this is more settling on the soul, on the heart. And this is not contradicting what Chazal said, כי הם לא כיוונו כמו שאמרנו שיהיה על כל פנים מוצא הדינים ההם מהמקומות אשר סמכו אותם להם, אבל הם אצלם מקובלים איש מפי איש עד משה רבינו, וביקשו להם רמז מן הכתוב כמו שזכר הרב המורה בספר המצוות ובפירוש המשנה. So he says, I'm not contradicting Chazal. Chazal were not telling me that these are the source of the halachot. These, again, were things that they received by tradition. These were just hints, allusions that they found to it in the verses, but it's not the source. And he says, he claims here that this is also what the Rambam's understanding is. As we'll see, that's not at all what the Rambam says. The Rambam says actually quite differently from the Ralbag on this point, or at least somewhat differently. Okay, so just to sum up the opinion of the Ralbag, and basically it's very interesting, he comes up in his own commentary, I think with his own, if I remember correctly, it's 9 midot she'Torah nidreshet behen, which he thinks is more in tune with the study of the Pshat, and that's sort of how he derives all the same halachot of Chazal. He's not arguing with Chazal, but he tries to derive them in a more, a method from the Psukim, which is more attuned to a study of Pshat, of a simple understanding of the text. So basically he says, the halachot were received by tradition. The Yud Gimel Midot, the 13 principles, is just a technique to try to find some sort of hints to it in the Psukim. There are places where the Gemara says that. The Gemara says regarding a few of these derivations, asmachta be'alma. In other words, it's just a smach means it's sort of like something to rely upon. It's not the actual source, but the common understanding, as we'll see, which is now going to be the opinion of the Ramban, that's the exception to the rule. According to the Ralbag, that's the rule for all of the halachot stated in the Talmud as derived from the 13 principles. Okay, so that's the first opinion we have of the Ralbag. Second opinion of the Ramban, and this appears to be the more prevalent opinion, this more simple understanding. Anybody who learns Talmud gets the impression that this is so, like the Ramban says. We're sort of jumping because the Ramban writes it as a critique, a response to the Rambam, but since it's a sort of a more simple understanding, then we'll start from there. The Ramban claims that basically any halachot, the 13 principles are real, they're valid, they are a technique which Hakhamim are deriving halachot by. It's not just halachot received by tradition. Some of them Hakhamim are innovating based on these techniques, and that's why we have a lot of disagreements regarding them. However, once the halakha has been derived, since it's not like a Chacham is making a decree on his own, he is deriving it from the verses of the Torah, then it has the status of Torah law. Okay, let's see where he says this. I quoted here on the source pages, I quoted quite a bit of the Ramban, but it's actually still only a little bit of what he writes in his whole critique here of the Rambam. But I just quoted some of the highlights. He says here as follows. I'm just reading here on the bottom, page 9. He says, אבל עיקר שורשי התלמוד, שכל הנדרשים בתלמוד באחת מ-13 מידות, כולם דברי תורה הם. All of them are considered to be Torah, words of Torah, Torah law. והם פירוש תורה שנאמרה למשה מסיני, and they are considered to be the pirush, the understanding, the commentary, the explanation of the Torah which was given to Moshe and Sinai. בין שנאמר שקיבלו אותם בפרט, whether they received them specifically, כגון שלמדו מפי הגבורה דקידושין בכסף, ושהם נרמזים בתורה מכיחה כיחה, ובשטר ושהם נרמזים ועצה ויתה. In other words, that when you, Kiddushin, he's referring to something we'll discuss a bit more later, but Kiddushin, when you want to be mekadesh a woman, which is to betroth her, which is actually the way marriage is done by the Torah, so there are different ways that you can do it. So the one which is sort of explicit in the psukim is ki kach ish isha u'be'ala, that you have relations with her. However, we know, as the first Mishnah in Kiddushin says that you can do it also with kesef, with something of monetary value, which is what we do with a ring, or we can do it with a shtar by giving her a document which states that you have been mekadesh her, that you have betrothed her. Okay, now these kesef and shtar, they're learned out from a technique of Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Ben. Because by kesef, we learn it out by a gzera shava. It says, ki kach ish isha, and when Avram Avinu buys the field from Ephron, it says, natati kesef hasadeh kach mimeni. So it uses the same expression as kicha, so therefore they learn here it can be money, here it's also money. Bishtar v'yatza v'ayta, just like a woman is divorced by a document, the get, so too she can be betrothed by a document. So he says this is halakha, which we received by tradition, but we can also find a source for it through the techniques of Yud Gimel Midot שהתורה נדרשת בהן. He says, וכן בבשר בחלב, נאמר לו בסיני שאסור באכילה ובהנאה, בין גדי בחלב עמו, בין שאר בהמה בחלב אחר, ונאמר לו שהן באים בכתוב מרובי המקרות. So this is another example of a halakha which was given by tradition from Sinai. For example, even though the Torah just says, do not cook milk with meat, we learn that by tradition that it applies also not just to cook, but also not to eat and not to derive benefit, and also that it's not limited to a kid in its mother's milk, but rather to any other domesticated kosher animal with milk of a domesticated kosher animal. And we also have a way to derive this from the midot שהתורה נדרשת בהן, as the Gemara in Masechet Hulin does. ובין שנאמרו לו הדברים סתם, ונצטוו לדרוש התורה בכללה במדרשי 13 מידות, והסכימו החכמים במדרש כל מצווה ומצווה. ואף על פי שבאו במקומות אסמכתאות, כבר אמרנו שהם מקשים ומתרצים בפירוש. So he says the other type is where the halakha was not received by tradition, but the rules of using the 13 principles, they were given. So according to the Ramban, and by the way, as we'll see, the Rambam does not disagree with the Ramban on this point, they received the 13 principles were also given to Moshe in Sinai, that Moshe was taught, and this was the tradition that he passed on. These are the principles which you use to interpret the Torah, to derive halachot from the Torah. So it can be used for halachot that you already know, because I told you those halachot specifically, but it can also be used to derive new halachot using these principles. So that's why these halachot are considered to be Torah law, because even though they weren't given in terms of their specific content, the technique by which they are derived was given in the oral tradition from Moshe to Sinai. So since, for example, you have the tradition was given to Moshe that you can use a gzera shava, an identical word that appeared, to derive a certain halakha. So therefore, even though that halakha specifically was not taught, since the method by which it was derived was given to Moshe Misinai, therefore the halakha itself that is derived, once the Hakhamim come to some sort of an agreement and ruling on what halakha specifically is to be derived from it, then that's also considered to be Torah law. And what he says at the end, yes, there are cases where Hakhamim said this is just an asmachta. In other words, it's just a hint. This is not really the source. Like, for example, a classical example of such a case where we have an asmachta is, there are many examples, but like, for example, all the shiurim, the sizes. So Chachamim found a hint to it in the Shivat Aminim, Eretz Chita V'Sorah. It's all a hint to the different sizes in the Torah. So there, the Chachamim say that's just an asmachta. The shiurim were received by tradition. We didn't really derive it from the verse. And there are other cases as well. But the Ramban says, though there's the exception to the rule, if you have not been told that it's an asmachta, then it's not an asmachta, it's a proper derivation, and whatever was derived by the 13 principles is Torah law. And again, as I said, this seems to be the sort of the simple, prevalent understanding. If you learn the Gemara, it seems that they're taking all these derivations very seriously. They're arguing about it, and it seems that all the halachot that are learned out are considered to have Torah status as Doraita laws. And like the Ramban says, it doesn't seem like they're just proving halachot that they received by tradition. It seems that they're actually innovating halachot, because it says this chacham came and this Amora or this Tana, and he learned it out from here, and then somebody else argued with him, no, you should learn out this from that. So it seems like they were actually actively engaging in producing halachot rather than just trying to prove whatever they received by tradition. But on the other hand, it does seem that since it's derived from the verses, that it does have Torah law. Okay, so those are the two opinions that I wanted to start out with. Now let's try and tackle the Rambam. Okay, so again, where does the Rambam write on this? So he writes on it on several places. The primary place that he writes on it, as we will see, is in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot. As I mentioned in the previous shiurim, in the introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, again, the Rambam wanted to produce his, even though there were lists of 613 mitzvot which preceded the Rambam, the Geonim had many lists. The Rambam disagreed with all their lists. He claimed that they just listed mitzvot randomly. There was no method to how they decided what should be counted as a mitzvah or not. So therefore, he compiled his own list of 613 mitzvot. The reason he wanted to do that, he writes, is that will serve as the basis for the Mishneh Torah. Because again, he was the first one to do it and the last one so far to attempt to write a book, the entire code of Jewish law. Nobody's attempted to do it since. Even the Shulchan Aruch is not on the entire, many halachot are left out from the Shulchan Aruch. Tumah v'tahara, Kodashim, we could go on. Shulchan Aruch only deals with practical halachot nowadays. The Rambam dealt with everything. So therefore he writes that he needs to set out the 613 mitzvot, and that will serve as the basis because he wants to write on all the mitzvot. So he first has to list them, and then he can expand and write his major work, the Mishneh Torah, on all of the mitzvot. Now, in order to count properly the 613 mitzvot, the Rambam says there has to be a method to it. You can't just randomly list mitzvot. You have to come up with the method, the criteria by which you define what is a mitzvah and what is not. So in his introduction to Sefer HaMitzvot, he lays out 14 principles. They are commonly known as shorashim, roots, the 14 principles by which you decide how a mitzvah is enumerated. So the first shoresh we discussed in the last time I gave a shiur, it was some time ago, and that's the Rambam said we do not list mitzvot that are derabanan. Okay, so for example, we have a mitzvah derabanan upcoming soon to read the Megillat Esther. The Geonim, some of them listed it in their list of 613 mitzvot. The Rambam said, not possible. 613 mitzvot are mitzvot min haTorah. Megillah is clearly a mitzvah derabanan, cannot be listed. And last time we had a whole nice discussion. Well, what exactly is the status of mitzvot derabanan? How binding are they? Second, now his second principle is, as we'll see, is do not list anything which is derived from the 13 principles of derivation, the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. Anything which was derived by the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem cannot be listed amongst the 613 mitzvot. Okay, that's going to be a second principle. And here he's going to get into a whole discussion of what exactly is these 13 principles about. Okay, so let's read it, and then we'll try and explain it at least as best as we can in the time that we have. So he says as follows, jumping up to the top of the source pages here, I found a translation to English in the Sefaria website, so I tried to lay it out parallel to the Hebrew. Again, as you can see, English is a much longer language than Hebrew. So he says as follows, כבר ביארנו בפתיחת חיבורנו בפירוש המשנה, שרוב דיני התורה יצאו ב13 מידות שהתורה נדרשת בהן. Okay, so he says, I've already laid out in my commentary to the Mishnah, most of the halachot of the Torah have been derived by these 13 principles. ושהדין היוצא במידה מאותן המידות, הנה פעמים תיפול בו המחלוקת. And things which are derived by these 13 principles, at times there will be disagreement amongst the Hakhamim regarding these laws. ושיש שם דינים, הן פירושים מקובלים ממשה, אין מחלוקת בהם. אבל הם מביאים ראיה עליהן באחת מ13 מידות, כי מחוכמת הכתוב ההוא שאפשר שימצא מורה מזמורה על הפירוש ההוא מקובל, או היקש יורה עליו וחובר באנו, זה העניין שם. Okay, this is similar to what we read in the Ramban earlier, that some of the halachot, י"ג מידות שהתורה נדרשת בהן, are innovations of Hakhamim, and some are actually just finding a basis for a halakha, a law that we already know by tradition. Now, this is a key point in the Rambam, because the Rambam, what he goes at length to claim there in his introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, is that any halakha which was received by tradition, there cannot be disagreement about, because that's the tradition. So if you know this halakha from tradition, what's there to argue about? So he claims any time that we find a machloket in the Chachamim regarding something, it cannot be regarding a halakha which was received by tradition, because once anybody comes along and says, not anybody, but somebody who is involved in receiving the tradition of the Torah Sheba'al Peh says, I have the tradition that this is the halakha, end of story, no more arguing. You cannot argue with a tradition. So therefore he says, all the halachot we received by tradition, there is no machloket on. If you see a machloket regarding something, then it's a halakha which Chachamim are innovating, using these 13 principles, but they're nevertheless innovating, and there they could have disagreements. So therefore, some of them are tradition, there is no machloket on, but they'll still use the 13 principles to find also a basis for it in the psukim, and some of them weren't received by tradition, they were innovated by Chachamim, and therefore there are disagreements regarding. Okay, and therefore, he says, וכשיהיה זה כן, הנה לא כל מה שנמצא לחכמים שהוציאו בהיקש מ13 מידות, נאמר שהוא נאמר למשה בסיני, ולא גם כן נאמר בכל מה שימצא ב13 מידות שיסמכו אל אחת מ13 מידות שהוא דרבנן. כי פעמים יהיה הפירוש ההוא מקובל ממשה מסיני, לפי הראוי בזה. שכל מה שלא תמצאו כתוב בתורה, ותמצאו בתלמוד שלמדו באחת מ13 מידות, אם באמרו הם בעצמם ואמרו שזה גוף תורה או שזה דאורייתא, הנה ראוי למנותו, אחר שהמקובלים ממנו אמרו שהוא דאורייתא. ואם לא יבארו זה ולא דיברו בו, הנה הוא דרבנן שאין שם כתוב יורה עליו. Okay, so what does he said here? He said as follows. So therefore, anytime I find something which is derived by these 13 principles, I cannot automatically say that it's from the Torah, nor can I automatically say that it's Derabanan. It depends. If I see this halakha that they've derived from the 13 principles, but Hakhamim themselves are telling me this is a guf Torah or this is deoraita, therefore, therefore I should count it as one of the 613 mitzvot. Why? Because they told us that it's deoraita. But if they haven't told me that it's deoraita, if they've never said that it's deoraita, then it is derabanan. Why is it derabanan? Very important words here. She'ein sham katuv yoreh alav. Because there is no verse, there's no pasuk in the Torah which instructs us it. Okay? So, okay, we'll just take this for now. In other words, basically, the Rambam understands that anything derived from Yud Gimel Midot, it's not considered as if it's written in the Torah. Therefore, it really should be Derabanan, unless the Hakhamim came along and told me that it is from the Torah. And therefore, and if the Hakhamim say it's from the Torah, then it's from the Torah. Okay? Now, this is a bit strange. Okay, we can already see it's a bit strange what's going on here, because if you're saying the criteria, you're telling me the criteria for something to be from the Torah is that it's written in the Psukim. Okay, so that's assumption A. Second assumption, the fact that I derived it from the Yud Gimel Midot does not make it as if it's written in the Psukim. Assumption B. So therefore, it's not from the Torah. So therefore, it must be the Rabbanan. Then how come if the Chachamim come along and tell me that it is Min Torah, then it is Min Torah? How does that magic occur? If it contradicts the first two principles that you said, that for something to be Min Torah, it has to be written. Okay, so that's already, we're starting to see that we're having difficulties here with the Rambam. But okay, let's bear with him. Okay, so basically he said Yud Gimel Midot. If Chachamim told me that it's Min Torah, then it's Min Torah. I'll list it amongst the 613 mitzvot. If they didn't say it, then it's Derabanan, and therefore I do not list it amongst the 613 mitzvot. Next. Okay. Now here he goes, he moves, he shifts to attack the Baal Halachot Gdolot. Again, one of the counters of the mitzvot in the Geonim. This is what he often does. He lays out a principle, and then he starts to attack his predecessors, the Geonim, and their lists. So he says, this is a principle that always confused somebody else. In other words, and he listed fear of the Chachamim as a positive commandment. But where does it say that you should fear the Chachamim? It doesn't say that anywhere. So he says, מאמר רבי עקיבא את השם אלוקיך תירא, לרבות תלמידי חכמים. חשב שכל מי שיגיע מ-13 מידות הוא מן הכלל הנזכר. So the commandment to fear the Chachamim is derived from the 13 principles. How is it derived? Because it says, את השם אלוקיך תירא. The word et seems to be unnecessary. It seems to be extra redundant. It should have just said, Hashem Elokecha Tira. So Rabbi Akiva came along and said, the et comes to also include Talmidei Chachamim, that you should also fear or have be in awe, not just of Hashem, but also of the Chachamim. So that's a derivation of Yud Gimel Midot. And therefore, the Baal Halachot Gdolot listed it as one of the 613 mitzvot. The Rambam comes along and says, no, that's a mistake. It was only derived by the 13 principles. Therefore, it doesn't actually state it explicitly in the pasuk. So therefore, it should not be counted. And he says, ואם היה עניין כמו שחשבו, למה לא מנו כבוד בעל האם ואשת האב, מצווה בפני עצמה, מחוברת אל כבוד האב ואם, וכן כבוד אחיו הגדול, כי אלו האישים למדנו שאנו חייבים לכבדם, בריבוי אמרו, כבד את אחיך, את אביך, לרבות אחיך הגדול, ואמרו את אביך לרבות בעל אמך, ואת אמך לרבות אשת אביך, כמו שאמרו את השם אלוקיך תירא לרבות תלמידי חכמים, אם כן מפני מה מנו אלו ולא מנו אלו. In other words, he says you should have counted many other mitzvot. For example, because Hakhamim said, kabed et avicha. Why does it say et avicha? It should have just said kabed avicha. Et comes to include your big brother. Okay, this is probably the halakha that my brother-in-law likes to quote all the time. He's always yelling at his sisters, kabed et avicha lerabot et achicha agadol. Okay, so that should have also been listed. If you're listing everything which is derived from the 613 mitzvot, you should have listed that as well. Okay, and he continues, וכבר הגיעו בזה הסכלות אל יותר קשה מזה. Okay, they have come into either a greater or even mistake more than this. וזה, כשמצאו דרש בפסוק, התחייב בדרש הוא לעשות פעולות, או, I think there's a double O here, mistake, או להרחיק עניין מן העניינים, והם כולם בלי ספק מדרבנן, ימנו אותם בכלל המצוות. In other words, sometimes there are things which are derived by these 13 principles, which the Rambam says are definitely derabanan, and nevertheless, they, the Geonim, will count them as mitzvot. ואף על פי שפשטי דקרא לא יורה על דבר מאותם העניינים, אם השורש הועילונו בו, עליהם השלום, והוא אומרם ז"ל, אין מקרא יוצא מידי פשוטו. והיות התלמוד בכל מקום ישאל פשטי דקרא במה הכתיב, כשמצאו פסוק ילמדו ממנו על צד הביאור והראיה דברים רבים. In other words, he says that by learning out, counting these things, which are these mitzvot, which are derived from the Yud Gimel Midot, they are actually contradicting the statement of Chazal, Ein mikra yotze midei pshuto. This is very interesting, okay? The Rambam understands that the pshat, Ein mikra yotze midei pshuto, the pshat, the sort of the simple understanding of the text, that's the authoritative ruling of the Torah. And if what's derived by the Yud Gimel Midot she'Torah nidreshet behem does not fit in with what we would call the Pashtei Dekra, the simple understanding of the text, therefore it cannot be min haTorah. It has to be miderabanan. Okay? In other words, the Rambam is sort of, what he's doing here, he's sort of telling us what's the problem with the Yud Gimel Midot she'Torah nidreshet behem, why they cannot be min haTorah, unless with the Chazal tell us that they're min haTorah. The problem is that they do not fit in with Pashtei Dekra. They do not fit in with what seems to be the simple meaning of the psukim. Only the Pashtei Dekra is considered the mitzvah ma'Torah, and that's what Chazal meant when they said En mikra yotze midei pshuto. Okay, let's go on. And now he gives an example of such a situation. He says, והנסמכים במחשבה זו מנו בכלל המצוות ביקור חולים וניחום אבלים וקבורת מתים בעבור הדרש הנזכר באומרו יתברך והודעת להם את הדרך ילכו בה ואמרו את הדרך זו גמילות חסדים. ילכו זה ביקור חולים, בה זה קבורת מתים, ואת המעשה אלו הדינים אשר יעשון זו לפנים משורת הדין. וחשבו כי כל פועל ופעולה מאלו הפעולות מצווה בפני עצמה. ולא ידעו כי אלה הפעולות כולם ודומים להם נכנסות תחת מצווה אחת מכל המצוות הכתובות בתורה בביאור והוא אמרו יתברך ואהבת לרעך כמוך. In other words, there's a verse, והודעתם להם את הדרך ילכו בה. From this verse, Chazal derived all kinds of things which you should do, including go visit the sick, go comfort the mourners, bury the dead, do chesed, acts of kindness and charity. So he says, all of these things, first of all, it says just vodatem lahem et haderech yilchu ba, teach them the way that they should go. It's a very general verse. You can't derive specifically from this verse. There might be a slight hint, maybe somehow to visiting the sick and comforting the mourners, but it's not the sort of seems to be the simple understanding of the verse. So they listed all of these, each one as a mitzvah bifnei atzma. The Rambam says no, they're not a mitzvah bifnei atzma. The only thing that the Torah says, and you can fit all of these under that umbrella, is ve'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You should love your friend as you do yourself. So if you love him, then you'll go visit him when he's sick, and you'll comfort him, and you'll bury the dead, and do acts of kindness, etc. But there's no commandment, separate commandment on each one of these acts. Okay, he gives another example of a case where they listed something which does not fit with the Pashtei Dekra, the simple understanding of the text. Okay, so I'm skipping to here. Now he says, ואולי תחשוב שאני בורח מלמנותן, ליותן בלתי אמיתיות והיות הדין היוצא במידה היא אמת או בלתי אמת, אין זו הסיבה. So in other words, maybe now somebody will come and say, oh, the reason why you don't want to count these is because you think they're not true. Says the Rambam, no, he says they're true. There's no doubt to their truth. He says, אבל הסיבה היא, כי כל מה שיוציא אדם ענפים מן השורשים שנאמרו לו למשה בסיני בבירור והם תרי"ג מצוות, ואפילו היה מוציא משה בעצמו, אין ראוי למנותם. In other words, he says it's not a matter of truth. They could be definitely true. They could have been said already by Moshe Rabbeinu himself. But the very fact that it's not what we call Nemru Moshe b'Sinai b'Virur, it's not explicit in the Torah, that's what makes it that I can't count it. In other words, it's not a matter of truth or not. The question is it written in the Torah? If it's not written in the Torah, again, on the pshat understanding of the Torah, it cannot be counted. Okay, and he brings more proofs for this idea. Let's see his conclusion. He says, הנה כבר התבאר כי תרי"ג מצוות שנאמרו לו למשה בסיני, לא ימנה מהן כל מה שילמד ב13 מידות, ואפילו בזמנו עליו השלום, כל שכן שלא ימנה בהן כל מה שהוציאו באחרית הזמן. Okay, so he says you cannot count anything derived by the 13 midot. Certainly you cannot derive what is learned later on. אבל אמנם ימנה מה שהיה בפירוש מקובל ממנו, והוא שיבואו המתיקים ואמרו שזה הדבר אסור לעשותו, ואיסורו דאורייתא, או יאמרו שהוא גוף תורה הנם נמנה אותו, כי הוא נודע בקבלה ולא בהיקש, ואומנם זוכרו ההיקש בו והביאו ראיה עליו באחת מ13 מידות, להראות חוכמת הכתוב כמו שבארנו בפירוש המשנה. He says the exception to the rule is where Hakhamim told us that this is Mina Torah. If they told us that it's Mina Torah, we have the tradition that this is Mina Torah, then we'll count it even though it's derived by the 13 principles, because in this case, the 13 principles are not the actual source of it. They're just a method to show where it appears in the Torah, but really it's not based on just on the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshin. Somebody asked in the chat what to do about the fact that there is no consensus on the Taryag. There is a consensus that there are 613 mitzvot. There just isn't a consensus on what they are. So there's not much we can do about it. That's the fact. There is no consensus. Okay. So some of the arguments are really usually just about, what criteria you use to count a mitzvah. Even if you follow all the Rambam's criteria, you could still get into arguments, and certainly apparently others didn't agree with that criteria. So that's because Chazal, all they said is that there are 613 mitzvot. They never actually produced a list. So that's why we have a lot of disagreements on that. Okay, so let's try and analyze what we saw in the Rambam, because it's really somewhat difficult. Basically, what he said is as follows. Again, you sort of, on the one hand, he's speaking about seemingly a very limited subject, which is, wait, somebody's also asking, maybe the concept of 613 itself was just a drasha. Look, if that's a whole other topic, but again, that's something the Ramban deals with at length. He raises that possibility. Maybe this whole 613 is just one opinion, maybe it's just a drasha, etc. But then he comes to the conclusion that since it's so unanimous in Chazal, that it is an accepted feature. So that's something you could debate, but another question is, when the Rambam says 13 midot, does he include in the same category all ribuim diukim through which the laws are derived? There is a discussion on that point. I did see an article that I was reading today. I actually put it in, if somebody wants, I can share it. That had a little bit of discussion. Maybe there are certain types of things learned out from the 13 midot which are not included. To my understanding, it all comes down to the following. As the Rambam here said, is it what we include in Pashtei Dekra or not? If it's not included in Pashtei Dekra, in the simple understanding of the text, and we'll soon discuss what that means, then it's automatically relegated into Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Ben. So I don't think it matters so much. It's from the 13 principles or maybe from another. The bottom line is, can I fit this into the understanding of the text or not? If I can, then that's the understanding of the text. If I cannot, then it automatically becomes sort of this other category, whatever that is. Okay, so let's try to analyze. We don't have that much time, but let's try and think about what we saw. So what is the Rambam saying essentially? So he said that basically, if we think about just in the limited sense of how you count 613 mitzvot, basically he said I'll only count in the 613 mitzvot something which fits in with Pashtei Dekra, what he calls the simple understanding of the text. Anything which is not, I won't, unless Hakhamim tell me explicitly that it is min haTorah. Okay. Now, that's a statement which is difficult on its own. Why is it difficult on its own? Because there are certain mitzvot which are counted, even though they do not fit in with what we would call Pashtei Dekra. They do not seem to be the simple understanding of the text. But okay, that's one problem that we have. That's one objection that the Ramban lists. Maybe to that, we could deal with somewhat easily if we somehow shift a bit on our understanding of what Pashtei Dekra means. So that's one point. Second point is, okay, if that's your criteria for counting mitzvot, what does it help that Hakhamim came and told me that it's min haTorah? What does that change? If you're defining that for me to list it amongst the 613 mitzvot, it has to be written somewhere in the Torah, then that's the definition. What is the tradition? What is Hakhamim coming along and telling me that this is min haTorah? How does that change things? Okay, that's the second issue we have with the Ramban. Now, the third and biggest issue that we have here with the Rambam is that he says, he didn't just say, we read him carefully, he didn't just say, don't count it amongst the 613 mitzvot. He also added in, he threw in a bomb here, that he said that it's derabanan. Okay? Now, if he's relegating all the halachot that we learn from the 13 midot Torah nidreshet behem to be derabanan, then we have some major problems. Because again, the Rambam himself said most of the halachot learned out that appear in the Talmud are learned out by the 13 principles. Most of them we do not have Hakhamim coming by and say explicitly they're min haTorah. So it would seem to be that all of those all of a sudden become relegated to just being derabanan. Now that's a very big problem. First of all, it doesn't fit in with the simple reading of the Talmud. Secondly, it doesn't fit in with the Rambam himself because he quotes endless of these halachot, and he doesn't say about them that they are derabanan. There are places that he says derabanan, but those are sort of, and we'll discuss a little bit, but those are sort of the exception to the rule. Most of the halachot seem to be min haTorah. Seem to be doraita. I'll give you the most famous example, perhaps. The Rambam wrote originally. He later on he changed his mind on it. There's a tshuva of his son, the Rabbi Avraham ben Rambam. But this is something quite famous, and I also brought here in the sources a little bit about it. That he wrote that kiddushay kesef, that when you are betrothed a woman, you do kiddushin on a woman with something of monetary value, like you do with a ring. That idea of doing kiddushay kesef, since it's derived by the 13 principles, that's derabanan. Okay. Now the question is, what does that mean? So if anytime I do kiddushin with a ring, the woman is only mikudeshet, we're only married midirabanan. Is that really correct? From the Rambam itself, it's evident that's not. He said specifically, once you've done kiddushin, even with something of monetary value, now they're married min haTorah. It's forbidden, punishable by death for her to have relations with another man. They need to get the works. It clearly cannot be derabanan. So that's probably the biggest issue that we have with with what the Rambam writes, that everything learned out from the 13 principles is derabanan. How can that be? That seems to contradict endless halachot, and that's sort of the biggest critique that the Ramban writes against the Rambam, that it cannot be that everything that we learn out from the 13 principles is only derabanan. Okay, so how to understand all of this? So we'll start with the last question. Regarding the last question, basically there are two approaches that, again, this is something which endless articles has been written about already from the earlier commentaries of the Rambam till today, including my late Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Nachum Rabinovich, wrote about it extensively. Basically, there are two approaches that have been taken. both of them highly problematic. One is to say that even though the Rambam wrote that it's D'Rabbanan, all he meant was that the source who said it is the Hakhamim. In other words, what he meant was just that since it's not stated explicitly in the Torah, it was stated by Hakhamim using these techniques. Therefore, he calls it D'Rabbanan, but really it has the power and authority of something, of any other halakha from the Torah. Why? Because ultimately, like the Ramban said, it is learned out from verses. So therefore, the source, whoever said it, is D'Rabbanan. In other words, it's the Hakhamim in terms of the source. But the authority, the power of the law is the same as any Torah law. And that's how they sort of want to solve this whole problem. Okay, so that's one approach that can be taken. The problem with that approach is that, first of all, it doesn't seem to fit the simple reading of the Rambam, and also there are also some other specific problems in various cases that they address that it seems to contradict this explanation. But that's one approach that you can take, and that's sort of the most common and widespread approach. Again, even they will tell you it is. So you'll ask, so what's the significance that it's D'Rabbanan? If it has the power of a Torah law, what's the significance? So they give several significance to it. Perhaps the most primary one is that it can be changed. The Rambam writes in Hilchot Mamrim that if one Beit Din comes along and derives a halakha from the 13 principles, then a later Beit Din can use the 13 principles to derive a different halakha and change the previous halakha. So they'll tell us, once it's derived, it has the principle of a Torah law, but it can also be changed by another Beit Din later on, because again, since the source, it wasn't received by tradition, the source is Hakhamim, so therefore it can be changed by a later Beit Din that will use the 13 principles differently. Okay, so that's one approach. Second approach says, no, when the Rambam said it's D'Rabbanan, he really meant it's D'Rabbanan, and all the endless halachot that seem to indicate that it's Mina Torah, somehow we'll find all kinds of solutions to work out all of them. Needless to say, they haven't really found solutions. That approach really hasn't found solutions for all of them. They've given certain examples of possible solutions, but that's also a very, very difficult approach. Okay, so we only have 5 minutes left, so I'll try to say a few points of my 2 cents on this. Okay, so let's start out with the first question. The first question was, let's see, we're here. How would the Rambam classify Halakha Moshe Sinai? Is this part count of the 613 and deemed to the Rabbanan Torah? No, the Rambam says it all depends. Even Halachot le Moshe Sinai, if they have a source in the verses, then they will be counted. If they don't have a sources, he also calls them the Rabbanan. Even though they were given by Hashem to Moshe and Sinai, since they're not written in the Torah, he calls them the Rabbanan as well. Okay, very interesting. The Rambam is very extreme. Min HaTorah can only, but doesn't matter if Hashem himself is the source. It has to be written in the Torah for it to be considered midoraita. Okay, so I'll try to briefly touch on some of the questions that we mentioned. So, okay, so let's try and take the first question. First question, we said, what is this idea of Pashtei Dekra about? So we usually, when we think of Pashtei Dekra, the simple understanding of the text, we think of when we read, let's say, Rashbam or Ibn Ezra, right? The commentators which really try to understand the simple reading of the text. I don't think that's what the Rambam here meant. And we can bring a lot of proofs for this. I'll just share with you one quick proof. This was actually one of the questions of the Ramban on the Rambam. We have one of the mitzvot that the Rambam lists is that relatives cannot serve as witnesses one on each other. Okay, it appears here, the mitzvah Reish Pei Zayin. איש שהסיר הדיין מקבל עדות הקרובים קצתם הקצתם, או קצתם עם קצתם, והוא אומרו יתעלה לא יומתו אבות על בנים ובנים לא יומתו על אבות. If you read that entire verse, what does it say there? לא יומתו אבות הבנים ובנים לא יומתו על אבות, איש בחטאו יומת. It means that a person only dies for his sins. He doesn't die for the sins of his fathers. That's the simple reading of the text. Not only is that the simple reading of the text, this verse is actually quoted in the book of Divrei Yamim with that meaning, that sons are not killed for the sins of the father and fathers are not killed for the sins of the sons. Nevertheless, that serves as the source that fathers are not killed by the testimony of the sons and sons are not killed by the testimony of the fathers. Okay, even though that's not what we would call the simple understanding of the text, that is the halachic understanding of the text, and therefore it's listed amongst the 613 mitzvot, and it is considered min haTorah. Why? Because again, when the Rambam was talking about Pashtei Dekra, he wasn't necessarily talking about the simple understanding of the text, as let's say the Rashbam attempts to do in his commentary on the Torah. He was talking about the simple understanding of the text as interpreted by the Torah Sheba'al Peh. And here the oral tradition interpreted this verse to mean this. Then this is the interpretation of the text. What would be a Yud Gimel Midot, which is the Rabbanan versus this text? The Rambam gives an example. The text only says fathers by the sins of the sons, sins of the fathers. What would be relatives from the mother side of the family, the maternal side of the family? Those are all in the Gemara, learned out by Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Bein. However, the Rambam calls all of those derabanan. Why? Because those don't even conform with the halachic interpretation of the text. Because all the halachic interpretation of the text said was sons are not killed by the fathers, fathers are not killed by the son. There's no mention of the maternal family. Therefore, that's all relegated to the Rabbanan. So first point is, Pashtei Dekra is the halachic interpretation of the text. Can you allow me 2-3 minutes to go over my time? Is that okay? Just to finish, okay?
Yeah, honor.
I apologize. I usually try not to do it, but I just to finish the thought. Second point is, the Rambam said that Hakhamim, if Hakhamim will tell me that something is from the Torah, I will list it. Even though it doesn't appear in the Psukim, it's only Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem. In a tshuva, which I quoted here, we won't read it in the side now, the Rambam says there are only 3 or 4 such cases. That's all. Okay? In other words, and we can find them in Sefer HaMitzvot. I'll just mention one example. Yain Nesech, the prohibition of drinking wine, which has been sacrificed by a non-Jew to idolatry. There's no source for it explicit in the Psukim. It doesn't say it anywhere. We know from Halakha that's in Isur Torah. The Rambam listed in Sefer HaMitzvot. He says, even though the source is only Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem, I have to list it because Hakhamim said it's Guf Torah. But there are only 3 or 4 such examples. So I don't think we should be that concerned about it. Those are what we would call the exception to the rule, right? The fact, if you have a rule, sometimes we think that if you have a rule which doesn't work 100% of the time, it only works 99% of the time, then there's something wrong with the rule. Doesn't have to be the case. You have 613 mitzvot. Out of them, 609 and 600 or 610 fit to this rule. That's good enough. The fact that I have 3 or 4 exceptions, not so bad. Okay, we can handle that. Okay, that's regarding that point. I wouldn't read too much into that. Those are just sort of the aberrations to the rule. It's not a problem. Last question. Is it derabanan or deoraita? Okay, and this is the most difficult part. But here, I think what the Rambam would say, if you gather all the information, he says, just the fact that it's derived by the 613 mitzvot cannot make it mina Torah. As we said, because mina Torah, according to the Rambam, has to be listed specifically in the Psukim. Anything which is not listed in the Psukim is automatically not mina Torah. But what does that mean? So just the fact that I learned it out from 613 mitzvot cannot make it mina Torah. However, it could still be on mina Torah for a different account. How is that possible? Because you have to sort of see what this halakha is telling me. Is this halakha interpreting a certain detail in a mitzvah mina Torah, or it's coming to add something else? So if, for example, the Torah said you have to do kiddushin to a woman, you have to betroth a woman. So it could be that I'll use the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet Behem to learn out that I can do it with something of monetary value. But ultimately, what I've learned out is that this is a way to do Kiddushin. And since the concept of Kiddushin is Min Torah, then that also becomes a Torah law. However, if I'm using the Yud Gimel Midot to add on to something onto the Torah, like the example I mentioned earlier, I'm adding, let's say the Torah said sons and fathers cannot serve as witnesses to each other. The Gemara learns out that also your wife's family also cannot, by somehow Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidresh B'hem. That's adding on to the verses. So that cannot be considered Min Torah. That's only Midrabanan. Again, that doesn't mean it's not authoritative. It is authoritative. But ultimately, the Rambam's criteria is that for something to be Min Torah, it has to be Min Torah. So I think if you sort of take all the things together, you have to sort of check each halakha on its own account. Is it interpreting a detail within the mitzvah Min Torah, or it's coming to add something beyond the scope of the basic principle of the Torah, which would relegate it to be the Rabbanan. Okay, so that's in very briefly my thoughts on this issue. I hope that made a little bit.
Livnat, thank you so much for that. Very, very, very insightful and fascinating to see a few different opinions. I'd love to see what questions there are. Anybody wants to unmute and ask any questions? Go ahead and do so, please. Who's first? Ohad, go ahead.
According to the Ramban, who says that all derivations essentially are deoraita, then according to him, what is this idea of en onshin min adin? If it's deoraita, then why not?
Yes, en onshin min adin, according to the Ramban, is a very much more limited concept than the Rambam understood it. The Rambam understood it as referring to all 13 midot Torah nidreshet ben. This ties into what I was speaking about, but we didn't have the time to deal with it tonight. According to the Rambam, it applies to all 13 midot Torah nidreshet ben. According to the Ramban, it's only limited to a kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer is sort of where you say, well, if the Torah punishes in this case, then this is much more severe than I should also punish in this case. So he says, by punishments, kal v'chomer, that system of kal v'chomer doesn't work by punishments, but it's only limited to kal v'chomer. It doesn't apply to any of the other 13 midot, according to the Ramban. That's by the way, the understanding of most Rishonim, that it's just limited to a kal v'chomer, that concept.
What would be the logic for limiting just kal v'chomer?
It's sort of that it has to do with how you understand punishments. In other words, you're saying, well, if you punish you, let's say you give the death penalty for this, then, well, this seems to be more severe, so certainly I should give the death penalty for that. But it's sort of saying, punishments is, it's the logic behind punishments is sort of something beyond us. We cannot make this judgment that we think this is more severe. Whatever the Torah instituted punishments, that's what we have. You cannot add on to it. But if you'll derive a punishment by the other principles, that's fine, according to the Rambam. It's only kal v'chomer that he's objecting to, because that's like a midah, which is more based on logic than a derivation from the text itself.
And according to the Ralbag, the entire halachic process is essentially relegated to just asmachta, which sort of deflates the entire process. Like, why spend so much energy? And if I have it from here and not from here, is there any nafkaminot for that?
Yeah, it's very strange. It's very strange, the Ralbag. That's what he writes, but it's very hard to see how that fits in with our understanding of the Talmud. I agree. That's definitely not the prevalent opinion. But it's always good to throw in a bit of a, I guess in America we would call a knuckleball. I don't know exactly what in the UK the equivalent would be.
Curveball.
Curveball. A curveball. Okay.
A curveball.
Okay.
Can I ask the Dayan, when you say that the Ramban classifies these as D'Rabbanan, you not just for the count, but for all the ramifications of whether you be Mahal Shabbat for a sick person, he's going the whole way and saying these things are in the case of, for example, you brought testimony from your wife's family. I don't know what the consequences might be. I haven't thought through what the consequences might be.
Yeah.
But he says in all these halachic consequences, we therefore treat them as D'Rabbanan. It's not just in the counting of the 613 mitzvot. It's correct. Across the board, is it?
Yes, correct. Okay, that's my understanding. But again, it's not everything which is Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet, and that's what I was trying to qualify. A good proportion of the Yud Gimel Midot Torah Nidreshet would actually be details within the Torah law, in which case they would be from the Torah law. when it's adding on to, then I think it's really the Rabbanan, and that's one of the strong examples for it. For example, if let's say I would do Kiddushin in front of false witnesses, right? Then the Kiddushin are no good mina Torah, but that's only if the witnesses are invalid from the Torah. But if they're only invalid mida Rabbanan, then the status is different. That would be a ramification. So if I take a maternal relative rather than a paternal relative as a witness, then according to the Rambam, according to the other Rishonim, that would be invalid from the Torah, the Kiddushin that I do in front of those witnesses. According to the Rambam, it would be different because that's only a Derabanan
Invalidation.
Yeah, for the witness. Correct.
Thank you very much. That helps.
Okay.
Anybody else?
If possible.
Yes, I have one question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Dayan.
You said very quickly that the Rambam was the only person to write a book trying to say, okay, this will be the only book you need, right? And but the Imam lawyers made the same claim, and I thought it was a trend. Obviously not, right? So what's going on here is, because I thought that the Hafez Chaim obviously tried. He only got a quarter of the way through. So could you?
Yeah, I mean, nobody's really been able to do it since. In other words, I don't think even the Rambam meant that you don't need any other books, but that's a whole other discussion. But there, like you said, there have been some who've started the project, but nobody's really done it in entirety, at least in my understanding, like the Rambam did. The Geonim started to write works on subjects rather than just writing commentaries on the Talmud. That was done before the Rambam. But to write a book of Halakha entirely on everything, systematic in that way, he's really unique.
Thank you.
Now the Manuez in the introduction, he sort of laments the loss of knowledge. People, especially with the Ottoman Empire at the time, and it was sort of written for people who didn't know how to read Hebrew. He says that, right? Which is different to the Rambam, which he was also, it was for the scholar as well as for the person who didn't know anything about Halakha. So it was a bit of a different target audience, which I think in the introduction to the Imam Loez, he does make that point.
Yeah. Even the Rambam himself, he writes that in the letter that he didn't mean that you shouldn't learn any other books. He himself taught the Rif and other books as well. It wasn't that he thought you should throw everything else to the recycle bin.
Anybody else? Or can the Rav go to bed now? It's 11:40 for the Rav.
Yeah, still early.
Still early. No more questions? Okay. Thank you all very, very much for being here. Dayan, Livnat, really, really, really honored to have you again. You've enriched us again. Looking forward to seeing you here teaching the Talmudim again. Everybody, please remember next week we've